In our session today, we're going to be discussing optimizing cluster shared volumes, cluster-aware updating, and upgrading a failover cluster. We're going to first take a look at optimizing cluster shared volumes. Now, during the lifetime of your file system, corruptions may occur which may require resolution through check this feature. Now that depends on your file system. If you are running the Resilient File System REFS, which is self-healing, you're not going to need to run check this because it's self-healing and it will correct the errors on its own. But if you're running NTFS, you might need to do check this from time to time. In fact, Microsoft recommends that you periodically run the defrag on your clustered shared volume. The first step in running that defrag is at an elevated Windows PowerShell prompt. You run the command suspend cluster resource cluster disk 1 redirected access, or within the Failover Cluster Manager console, you can right click on the cluster shared volume and select turn on redirected access. Note that if you attempt to run the defrag on the clustered shared volume without first putting it in redirected mode, you're going to get an error. The error that you will see is CSVFS failed operation as volume is not in redirected mode. So be sure to put that command redirected mode. For step 2, the second thing that you want to do is to defrag. So at the command prompt, you run the command defrag.exe and the path of your volume, which is C cluster storage volume 1. Step 3. Once the defrag has completed, you want to revert the cluster shared volume back into direct mode. And you can either do it by running the command at your PowerShell prompt, resume cluster resource, cluster disk 1, or within the Failover Cluster Manager, you want to right click on the cluster shared volume and select turn off redirected access. Next, we want to turn our attention to cluster-aware updating. And the cluster-aware updating is a new feature in Server 2012 that addresses the difficulty of performing software updates on failover cluster nodes. In Server 2008 R2, we had failover clusters that could contain up to 60 nodes. And to perform a software update on each of those nodes, what we had to do is to move all the roles off that one node, update the software on that node, restart the node, and then repeat that process for every node one at a time. With Server 2012, that changed because with Server 2012, the failover cluster could have hosted up to 64 nodes. And you can imagine that trying to move all the rows off of one node one at a time for 64 times would simply not be practical. Instead, in Server 2012, we can now automate the process of updating software using cluster-aware updating. Let's take a look. In Windows Server 2012, to automate the process of updating software, we have to initiate the process within the Failover cluster console. And what we want to do is on the cluster itself, we can see here cluster1.adatom.com. We want to right click on the cluster. Then from more actions in the drop down menu, we want to come over and click on cluster aware updating. Within the cluster aware updating window, you want to look over to the right on the cluster actions and you want to select configure cluster self-updating options. So let's click on that. And we have the get started wizard. This wizard is a wizard that will help us configure the cluster to use self-updating mode. And when we configure self-updating mode, it means that we're going to set a schedule of the time when the cluster will automatically update itself. So you don't have to manually go and update the cluster. You can set a schedule of when you want that to happen, and the updating will run automatically based on the schedule options that you choose in this wizard. If the cluster role is not already configured on this cluster, the wizard will actually help you configure the role. Let's click on next and see. Sure enough, here we have the option of adding the cluster updating role with self-updating mode enabled to this cluster. So let's click on the checkbox and then select next. Now you can see in this screen that we can set a self-updating schedule. We can set the frequency of self-updating, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly. We can set the starting time, the time of the day of the week, and so on. Let's click next to continue. We have some advanced options that we can also set. And you can see that we can make changes for this updating run only. So you have stop after, warm after, maximum retries per node. You can make whatever change you want if you are making changes for this updating run only. Then you click on next. If you want to configure any additional options, then you can do so for Windows Update by clicking in the checkbox. We're going to, for our purposes, go ahead and click Next. And we can take a look at the confirmation screen. We have a cluster named Cluster 1. Self-updating is enabled. We have a scheduled time. And we have configured additionally the maximum retries per node. And we want to click on Apply. And we see here that we have success for the self-updating option. So we want to go ahead and click on Close. We have the choice of triggering an update to a cluster manually or setting a schedule, as you saw just now, to set the self-updates. You can also run a script to set the schedule time for the updates. We want to turn our attention to the last topic in this session, upgrading the failover cluster. In our scenario, let's say that we have a failover cluster and the cluster has two nodes, node A and node B. We have the virtual machine role on node A. That is, we have some virtual machines on node A. The first thing that we want to do is to move all the virtual machines from that first node, node A, to the second node in the cluster, node B. Our second step is to shut down the cluster service and evict that first node from the cluster. Let's take a look at that. We can see here that we are in the Failover Cluster Manager console. We want to right-click on the node, and on the drop-down menu, we want to click on More Actions. And there we can see we have on the right-hand side, you have the tab here to stop the cluster service. So we want to stop that cluster service. And after we have stopped the cluster service on that node, we want to evict the node by clicking on Evict. So that is done within Failover Cluster Manager. After we have evicted that first node from the cluster, what we want to do next is to perform a clean install of Server 2012, and on that node, create a new cluster. Bear in mind that we are upgrading a 2012 cluster to a 2012 R2 cluster. That is why we needed to do a clean install of that node, putting on 2012 R2. Our third step. After we have done that, we then want to take the virtual machines that we had put on the second node, and we want to migrate those machines to the new cluster that we just created on node A. Our fourth step is we want to destroy the original cluster. Remember that we now have two clusters, the new cluster that we made and the original cluster, because we have not destroyed the cluster as yet. We simply shut down the cluster service and evicted the node. We now want to destroy that original cluster. Let's take a look at that. To destroy the cluster, we need to right-click on that cluster. We need to click on More Actions. And on the right-hand drop-down, we need to click on Destroy Cluster. After we have destroyed that original cluster, the next thing that we want to do is to do an install of Server 2012 R2 on the second node and install the cluster role on that node. After we've done that, we then need to validate the cluster functionality and make sure that the cluster is operational and working. So those are the steps that we would take to upgrade a cluster from Server 2012 to Server 2012 R2. Note that you're going to have some downtime, because if you shut down the cluster service, then there will be downtime. In Server 2016, we have what is now called a rolling upgrade, where we can actually upgrade the cluster without shutting down the cluster service by upgrading one node at a time, removing that node, upgrading it, and joining it back to the cluster until the entire cluster is upgraded. This is the end of our session, and I want to thank you for listening.